They were born into a tight-knit world of wealth and privilege, and could have lived in a bubble of comfort and luxury. But instead, Josephine and Frank Duveneck lived their lives helping others with tireless generosity. Indeed, Frank and Josephine Duveneck's lives defined the social history in Los Altos and the Bay Area region during the last century. They weren't afraid to tackle difficult problems, to channel their own resources, to break molds, or to fight prejudice. Together, they reflected the best our area has ever produced. They were very ahead of their time, forward-thinking trendsetters, dedicating their lives to social justice for all people. Josephine Whitney Duveneck was born in Boston in 1891, the youngest of 5 children. Josephine's mother, Margaret Green Whitney, and her father, Henry J. Whitney, president of the first electric train system, were among Boston's most socially prominent at the turn of the last century. Josephine's sheltered childhood included governesses, a summer home, horses, and private schooling. The independent young girl was taught at home until she was 12. Then she enrolled in Miss Haskell's School for Girls in Boston, where she made her first good friends and developed her love of writing. Like many other teenagers from her social background, Josephine accompanied her mother to Europe, where she studied French and German. After high school, Josephine was officially introduced to Boston society at debutante balls and parties. Josephine first met Frank Duveneck at one of those debutante parties. It was love at first sight for Frank, but it took a while for Josephine to warm up to him and let him start courting her. Frances Boot Duveneck was born in 1886 in Florence, Italy, to Elizabeth Lizzie Boot and artist Frank Duveneck, the internationally acclaimed portrait painter. Frank Duveneck Sr.'s work is very collectible to this day. Many of his paintings reside in museums across the United States, among them the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. Tragically, Frank's mother died unexpectedly of pneumonia before Frank was 2 years old. Devastated by his wife's death, Frank Sr. sent his young son to Boston to live with his wife's relatives, Ella and Arthur Lyman. Just like his parents and future wife, Frank grew up in the tradition of Boston's Victorian society. He spent his vacations in Waltham, Massachusetts at the family summer home called the Vale. It was there that Frank began his lifelong love of nature, especially trees and flowers, that he would later apply to the grounds of Hidden Villa. In school, Frank excelled in math and science, and in 1909, he graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering from Harvard University. This love of engineering became a lifelong interest. It was during Frank's last year at Harvard that he met and fell in love with Josephine Whitney. They found that they shared a love of music, dancing, and nature, and after a 2-year courtship, they were married in King's Chapel in Boston, June 7, 1913. Because of Frank's considerable inheritance from his mother's family, the Boots, who owned textile mills in Massachusetts, Josephine and Frank were able to spend their first year of marriage traveling in Europe and Asia. After that, they returned to Boston and soon welcomed their first child, Elizabeth. But growing tired of East Coast winters and conservative viewpoints, Josephine and Frank decided to head for California. The young couple was looking for adventure and more openness, both in space and attitudes. They moved to Carmel, where Frank enlisted in the Army in 1917. He served the last year of World War I in Germany and France. During that time, Josephine moved from Carmel to Palo Alto with her now 2 children, Elizabeth and Frances. The Duvenecks' 3rd child, Hope, was born in 1918 while Frank was away in the Army. Their 4th child, Bernard, arrived in 1922 after the war. After World War I, the Duvenecks settled down in Palo Alto with their 4 children. While Josephine managed the household and children, Frank ran the San Francisco Stanley Steamer Agency in San Francisco and taught at Stanford in the physics department. In 1923, a new phase of Frank and Josephine's life began. On one of their weekly outings in the foothills, Josephine and Frank came upon a for sale sign in front of the Hidden Villa Ranch along Moody Road. They had long admired the land from the foothill ridges, but had never before seen, close up, their secret valley. Excited by the opportunity to own country land, they bought the 1,000-acre ranch to use as a summer place. In 1929, they built a large home on the property and moved their family from Palo Alto to Moody Road in Los Altos Hills. Eventually, the Duvenecks added more acreage to the original tract, so at one time, Hidden Villa encompassed over 2,000 acres. In the 30s, they established a youth hostel on the land, the first on the West Coast. There, they welcomed visitors of all ethnicities from all over the United States and the world. Sarita Berry shares her story.
And one of our professors, Joseph Conard, who was a Quaker and who knew the Duvenecks, said, well, if you're going to go to California, I'm going to write you a note to give to friends of ours. Well, I'd never been to California. I certainly never heard of the Duvenecks, but we took this note and put it away very carefully and got married, spent the summer on the East Coast, and drove across country. Finally arriving at Stanford, where we were going to be. And after Paul got all registered, we looked at the note and thought, well, let's see if we can find this place. So we asked directions and drove to Hidden Villa and met Josephine and Frank Duveneck, who invited us to stay while we got settled. So the first night I ever spent in California, I spent at Hidden Villa.
Josephine often talked about the spiritual quality of Hidden Villa. She described how she would often be overcome by a sense of past lives that had lived in serenity and fulfillment there on the land. Elizabeth Bowden Smith and others agree.
And then I drove through the green gates, which were very much there, and the flags that said Hidden Villa. I drove up the road and there was just this sense of this being a sacred place. And I had no reason at all to have any idea what was going on. It just hit me as this is really sacred.
I do believe it is a sacred piece of land, and I would maintain that many people, when they come to Hidden Villa, no matter what their world might be outside and the traffic stresses to get here or the things they're thinking about in the car as they arrive, that if you allow this space the openness of heart, it will provide that sense of tranquility and peacefulness, which has been a major factor in keeping me here for the many years I've worked at Hidden Villa.
Because as you go through the iron gates to Hidden Villa, automatically you have a feeling of serenity and peace.
In 1925, with like-minded parents, Frank and Josephine established a progressive school called Peninsula School in Menlo Park in the former Coleman Mansion. Josephine, along with the other parents, mostly from Stanford, wanted a school that encouraged creativity. The school's mission was to help students become more socially conscious, independent, and productive. Daughter Hope Duveneck Williams remembers.
Well, we went to Peninsula School, which my mother more or less was very active in starting with various other parents. Peninsula School was kind of a wild, unstructured place to start with. There was only just one teacher that was trained. The others were parents. So it was fairly wild, but lots of fun, and we did a lot of creative things. We did a lot of artwork, a lot of writing. We were allowed to paint murals on the walls.
Today, more than 80 years later, the Peninsula School is still thriving. Throughout her life, Josephine pursued her quest for a spiritual life. becoming increasingly interested in Quakerism and active with the American Friends Service Committee.
As far as various religions were concerned, she tried out all kinds of things, and so she knew what she was talking about. And when she became a Quaker, that was what she was interested in, and it kind of fitted her philosophy.
Because people, when they feel like they're right and you're just, you can get really holy then. And she didn't like that, even that temperament. And so she ended up with, in my view, the American Friends Service Committee, which is sort of the outreach of the Quaker religion. But they were just like out there doing really, really sound, really good stuff without preaching. And that suited her.
Always known as a strong-willed, decisive person, Josephine is described by her family and friends.
She was a mover and a shaker. I think she and my father, had a close relationship. And she was very, very good with children. I think she was a good mother, very attentive and very directed.
She was really quite connected with a lot of problems that people had, and she was a wise person.
I was very fortunate to meet Josephine early on when we moved here. And I first met her, literally, at a United Nations Association meeting in Palo Alto. And it was very clear that this was a person with presence. She was the tallest one amongst the women who welcomed me, and she also had this marvelous, cultured voice that came from Boston. And she was welcoming and kind and inclusive and generally interested in what she was doing at the United Nations Association.
Even if she wasn't off the ranch. When I was a camper, she did all of the shopping, so she would always go to Los Altos and do the shopping, and I can still see the stores that were there then. And I had the privilege of going with her a couple of times.
She wasn't shy about telling you what she thought would be best for you. But at the same time, if you stood up, if you disagreed, she wouldn't try to overpower that. She would listen to that.
But I think Josephine was a true leader and a true visionary to really be able to look ahead and see what needed to be done.
Frank had a very different personality.
Frank was an extremely quiet man. You often did not know where you stood with him, but if you did the wrong thing, he certainly would let you know. Very, very sweet man. Very much the boss in a quiet way.
He was more reserved. He wasn't as skilled as his wife in terms of interpersonal relationships, but he was thinking about those things, and you wouldn't. He spoke in different ways, through actions and through the things that he did physically, and the acts of kindness that he would do for the world.
He was always sort of present, but not, in the middle of things. So he would come to events, but he wouldn't necessarily jump in or, want to be noticed particularly.
Mr. Duveneck was also dressed like Mrs. Duveneck, in jeans and in an old work shirt and a hat. And at that time, I had no idea that he was, he taught at Stanford. He knew a lot about biology, and I think he did some hybridizing on corn.
His main job was in Stanford University. He worked on some of the early experiments in
X-ray.
X-rays, which they were doing then in connection with a hospital in San Francisco. And I don't remember when he left that particular job, but then after that he just worked on the ranch and did stuff. Of course, he was very much interested in plants and had quite a garden there. As a child, he did amazing stuff with his hands, making toys and so forth. He was good in blacksmithing, and he did a lot of that was still in the house today.
When World War II broke out in 1941, the U.S. government began a mass relocation of Japanese Americans into internment camps, where they would be held until the end of the war.
Of course, the whole tragedy of the evacuation starts with December 7th, 1941, and then the next significant date was February 17th, 1942, when President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, delegating to the commanding general of the Western Civil Defense Command the ability to evacuate persons. Didn't say Japanese, Germans, Italians, just said persons. General DeWitt then took that order to say, we're going to use it to evacuate and intern those of Japanese ancestry. We'll just evacuate them all, put them in camps. And so he took over county fairgrounds and selected racetracks because they both had living quarters.
Frank wrote many letters to the editors of the country's leading newspapers protesting the government's policies. Josephine and her friend Gerda Eisenberg became involved in helping the Japanese Americans however they could.
And the person that Mother worked closely with was Gerda Eisenberg, who lived up on top of the hill and was a close friend of Mother's.
Josephine and Gerda were very involved. They felt that it was an injustice to these, especially the American-born Japanese that had to go to camp, and so they just helped them. And when they had to go to Tanforan, because the camps weren't really finished, so they housed a lot of the Japanese early on in the Tanforan horse stalls, very primitive. So my mother and Josephine would gather coats and items that they needed and take them there.
So now the Friends Service Committee, including Josephine Duveneck and Frank Duveneck, got in the act. We must help these people. They only had, at the very most, a week to get ready to leave. The camps were not ready because nobody had planned anything. So the people, the Japanese, were put on the racetracks. They seemed to be the only housing they could provide at the time.
During the evacuation, many Caucasian people would come to the train station in Mountain View and help them out. Maybe they've forgotten something at home. And somebody said that it was either Mrs. Duveneck or somebody like her, and I don't want to give misinformation, had gone to this man's house who had forgotten his false teeth at home, and so she went back and got them.
At the end of the war, Josephine and Frank, working with the American Friends Service Committee, opened Hidden Villa to both Jewish refugees who had escaped the Nazis and the returning Japanese Americans from the internment camps.
Gerda and Josephine both were very instrumental in finding jobs for them when they were coming out of the camp.
She also made sure that people who came back from camp had some place to stay, so she would offer to have them stay at the ranch. And I don't know how many people took advantage of that, but she did that a lot.
In 1944, we were in Topaz, and Mrs. Duveneck from Hidden Villa, she sent a message, an invitation, and it was placed in the Topaz Times. She sent this letter and an invitation to come to her home, and that the person could work and then help them adjust to coming back to the Bay Area. When Mrs. Duveneck invited someone to come, my mother, she took the opportunity. She writes back to Mrs. Duveneck because she did not want to worry my grandmother and her mother-in-law. She left in the middle of the night, and we took a train out, and of course we arrived at Hidden Villa. Mrs. Duveneck picked us up on the train. You know, the banana wagon was always there to pick up people.
Because of their experience with prejudice during World War II with the Japanese and European refugees, and their deep commitment to diversity, Josephine and Frank established an interracial camp after World War II, where both campers and counselors came from different ethnicities.
You know, the Japanese were evacuated to places outside of California, and this is the thing that Josephine and I were very much concerned about, and this is the thing which led us to start our summer camp.
And it was a very cutting edge, the camp was a very cutting edge idea at the time. It started in 1945. At a time when, you know, the whole issue of integration was just not on anybody's radar. And people said to Josephine, no one's ever going to send their kids to your camp because this whole diversity thing, why? Josephine, from what I've read, really believed that if you bring children together at a young age and let them live together and play together, they will see that everybody has the same basic needs and desires in life.
She wanted people of various races and religions and cultures to be mixed together, because her feeling was that if you mix people together, they are going to get along.
And I think that's one of the things that camp does, and HVP too, is they really work with kids. And this is part of the social justice even, I think. You know, all the kids are different at camp. It doesn't make any difference. And they learn that everybody's the same. And so I think this is very much ingrained in what is taught there, and it passes from person to person.
Frank and Josephine always believed and practiced what they believed, that people of various colors were always welcome at Hidden Villa, and the camp was part of their creation to make sure this belief was living at the Hidden Villa.
Well, the summer camp, I think, is the heart and soul of Hidden Villa. It's, I think it represents Josephine at what she cared about the most. I think Josephine was a person who would have very much appreciated all of the environmental education that's gone on and how that program has grown since her death. But I think that the most important thing for her was reaching the kids at summer camp and bringing such diverse kids together.
From the time of the first Earth Day, Hidden Villa's summer and day camps have stressed environmental education.
1969 was the very first Earth Day, and I think Josephine, just like her summer camp idea, said, you know, we need to respond to this. We need to start an environmental education program. And, you know, there were no environmental educators out there. It was a non-issue. There was nothing.
Well, the environmental education programs, as with all things at Hidden Villa, are a blend of retaining and sustaining the traditional programs and looking for ways to keep them creative and innovative and moving forward and relevant. I hope and believe that the core rationale behind those programs is the same as the vision that Josephine had back in the first Earth Day in 1970, where she said, you know what, we have this amazing resource called Hidden Villa. We should do something about this environmental thing. And lo and behold, here we are in 2010, seeing the benefits of that vision and continue to provide those programs. And I think the core thing that she talked about at that time was the really essential piece of having children be outdoors, in nature, coming to terms with and finding their own relationship with the natural world.
But we're sending all these fresh ideas and people out into the world to change the world, and it's ongoing. I mean, I really believe in my environmental education teaching that I am changing the world one child at a time.
And it's a real marriage between environmental education, the summer camp, social justice, growing animal systems and food systems in a 2008 world, and trying to use all the tools that we have at our disposal for being green.
Besides their work with the Japanese Americans and the refugees, Frank and Josephine also worked with Native Americans on their reservations, and with the African Americans who had come to Oakland to help in the shipyards during the war. In the 1960s and early 70s, they provided meeting space for Cesar Chavez as he organized the Mexican farm workers movement. In the 60s, Frank and Josephine became involved with the Fair Play Council that promoted fair housing for all minorities. Mary Davy and Liz Dana recall.
The most important event that came up during these early years was an event in 1964 when I managed the campaign in Los Altos Hills to stop Measure Proposition 4 that was on the ballot. And it was a proposition put on by the realtors to stop anyone to allow, really, anyone who wanted to discriminate against someone because of color in the sale or purchase of housing. This Prop 14 was a statewide proposition, and this area, the peninsula, was very much against it, and obviously the Duvenecks were too, because of their interest in World War II and what had happened to the Japanese and also to the black community that had come to Hunters Point to work in industry and to build the ships. And the Duvenecks were extremely important in seeing these people who were moving from the South or the West or being taken away from their homes, the Japanese, in this area. And they started an organization called the Fair Play Council. So this was, of course, a great reason why they were interested in the Proposition 14. And we became active and knowledgeable about how to reverse this. And actually, this area was one of the only areas, along with one community in Southern California, that voted it down, because the way was to stop it instead of becoming law.
The Fair Housing Committee was an attempt mostly to find fair housing for minority groups. At that time, it was very, very difficult to either rent or buy a house if you were other than white.
Through all of this, Hidden Villa had not only become a haven and refuge for minorities, but also a wonderful gathering place for people of all ages. The sustainability of the land has become a concern as Hidden Villa goes forward.
The big question of how much can this land take? How many people can it take? You know, how much just runs it down? And so this was a big issue in trying to figure out what that was. And of course, it's grown really a lot since then.
As Josephine and Frank neared the end of their lives, they asked their family for advice on what to do with Hidden Villa. Frank Duveneck and others recall.
I had already given a piece of land to the open space district. And then I got to thinking that if I died, then the whole thing would be thrown open, and the only way that one could pay the inheritance taxes on the thing would be to sell. And this is where my children came in, because they felt the same way that my wife and I felt about the thing. And I suppose if we hadn't put it in a trust and had sold it, they'd made an awful lot of money out the thing, but that's the thing which they didn't want to do.
And then, of course, the 4 offspring were absolutely supportive of what Frank and Josephine wanted. All 4 siblings were with their partners in life, were very supportive, and they watched over this with increasing interest that it was changing from the time that they had been here growing up as children, but now they were willing to have this a community resource. And so the family and the offspring all agreed to do this. And it was during this time that the Open Space District negotiated with the Duvenecks to buy the development rights or an open space easement for all of the upper reaches, the 1,450 acres for the upper reaches, to keep it always as open space, because this was what the Duvenecks wanted.
The fact that all of the children have been as generous as their parents about the donation of that land for public purposes when they could have cleaned up on it is another indication of how strong the influence of the parents and how it goes on through the family, through the next generations. The intention is to leave the 1,700-acre ranch to Hidden Villa Incorporated, which will then carry on the activities, the hostel, the children's summer camps, the environmental volunteers, and the welcome to busloads of school children and so on, exactly as Josephine and Frank set it up in the first place. So that what they set up, I think, is more or less guaranteed in perpetuity.
I think we all, we grew up there, we loved the land, and to have it split up, money wasn't our object at all. We wanted to preserve it, and, it's that simple.
It's a strange and curious and comical situation in a way that here is a private ranch which they could surround with 10-foot woven wire fences and keep people out and keep their own little paradise intact and enjoy it for themselves, which is the way an awful lot of people do utilize country land these days. And it's open to anybody who wants to walk in there. And people behave very well when they walk in there. They somehow understand that this is a very special place.
The Trust for Hidden Villa is an incredible gift to our region by this most remarkable family. The hostel welcomes travelers from all around the world. Children of all races enjoy Hidden Villa's camps, and the public is welcome to hike, enjoy the products of the organic farm, and enjoy the scenery. Last year, Hidden Villa welcomed over 30,000 people.
And I think Hidden Villa is very much a heart place. And once people are attached, you're always attached. And so people cared a lot about that this wouldn't just go away.
The place has never been as important to me. The physical part of Hidden Villa has never been as important to me as what it stands for and what it does.
During their lifetime, Josephine and Frank Duveneck touched the lives of thousands of people, some during periods of tremendous trials.
Josephine and Frank were, they had money, and they used it in a way that other people did not. They were humanitarian. Josephine stretched her interests so widely. I mean, it wasn't just the Japanese, it wasn't just the black community, it wasn't the Indians, it was all of humanity.
I think both of them later on assumed the responsibility of helping people who were downtrodden.
They just had a set of principles and lived by them. And they were inspiring for that reason. Because I never felt they preached anything in particular. They were just who they were.
I think Josephine and Frank epitomized the very best in human behavior. They were clear thinking, they were empathetic, they were warm, they were supportive. You think of how many people they helped. Not only that, but how they cared about the land, you know, how they cared about the world, how they cared about the people who weren't given a fair shake, you know. They have marked my life. They really have.
The Hidden Villa welcome sign posted at the entrance is an enduring symbol of Josephine and Frank's spirit of openness and generosity. As Josephine said in her book, Life on Two Levels, no one can own land. Custodianship is a sacred trust that involves great responsibility along with the enjoyment. Being able to contribute vital experiences to growth is the great reward.